I never thought I would end up in pretrial detention. It all started with a night out with friends that went horribly wrong. I had a little too much to drink and got into a fight with a stranger outside the bar. Before I knew it, I was being dragged away in handcuffs. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in a cell, alone and scared. I had never been in trouble with the law before, and the thought of spending time in jail was overwhelming. As the days passed, I tried to keep my head down and avoid trouble. But the other inmates were not so friendly. They would glare at me as I walked by, muttering threats under their breath. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard a commotion outside my cell. I peeked through the bars and saw a group of inmates gathered around a new arrival. He was a big guy, covered in tattoos and scars. As I watched, the new guy started shouting and cursing at the others. He looked like he was about to start a fight. I knew I needed to stay out of it, but I couldn't help but watch. Suddenly, the new guy turned and looked right at me. I froze, feeling a chill run down my spine. He started walking towards me, his eyes fixed on mine. I backed away, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. But he kept coming, his steps slow and deliberate. Just as he reached my cell, a guard appeared and broke up the fight. The new guy was dragged away, still shouting curses and threats. I spent the rest of the night shaking in my cell, unable to sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something much worse than a fight. The next day, I was released on bail. As I walked out of the detention center, I promised myself that I would never get into trouble again. The memory of that night would stay with me forever, a reminder of how close I had come to danger. I never thought I would find myself in a pretrial detention center. I always thought I was too smart to get caught up in something like that, but life has a funny way of humbling you. It was my first night in the facility, and I was scared. I had heard stories about how dangerous these places could be, and I was determined to keep my head down and stay out of trouble. I was sitting on my bunk, trying to ignore the sounds of people shouting and fighting in the distance, when I heard a knock on the door. I hesitated for a moment before getting up to answer it. Standing outside was a man who looked like he had just stepped out of a horror movie. He was covered in tattoos and had a scar running down the side of his face. He introduced himself as Big Tony and asked if I wanted to join his crew. I knew that I should have said no, but I was so scared and alone that I thought it might be safer to have someone on my side. I agreed to join his crew, and he took me under his wing. At first, things seemed to be going well. I was protected, and I had access to things that I wouldn't have had otherwise. But then I started to notice that Big Tony was involved in some shady deals. One night, he came to my cell and told me that he needed me to do something for him. He said that he had a plan to escape, and he needed my help. I knew that this was a bad idea, but I didn't want to anger him, so I agreed. We started to put our plan into action, but something went wrong. The guards caught us, and we were separated. I was put into solitary confinement, and I didn't see Big Tony again. It wasn't until later that I found out what had happened. Big Tony had been planning to use me as a distraction while he made his escape. He had never intended for me to make it out alive. I was lucky to have survived, but I learned a valuable lesson. In a place like that, you can never let your guard down. You never know who you can trust, and sometimes the people you think are your friends are really your worst enemies. I never thought I would end up in pretrial detention. It was a nightmare come true. I was charged with a crime I didn't commit, and the police refused to believe me. The judge set my bail so high that I couldn't afford it, so I was stuck in the detention center until my trial. The first few days were uneventful. I kept to myself and tried to stay out of trouble. But things took a dark turn on the fourth day. I was sitting on my bunk, reading a book, when I heard a commotion coming from down the hall. I looked up and saw a group of inmates walking towards me. They were big, burly guys, covered in tattoos and scars. I could feel my heart racing as they approached me. "Hey there, pretty boy," one of them said, sneering at me. "You look like you could use a friend." I tried to ignore them and went back to my book, but they weren't having it. They started taunting me, calling me names, and threatening me. I knew I was in trouble. Suddenly, one of them lunged at me. I scrambled off my bunk and backed up against the wall, trying to defend myself. But they were too strong, and I knew I couldn't take them all on. Just when I thought it was over, the door burst open, and the guards rushed in. They quickly subdued the attackers and dragged them away. I was shaking with fear, but I was also relieved. If the guards hadn't arrived when they did, I don't know what would have happened to me. After that incident, I knew I had to be more careful. I stayed away from the other inmates and kept to myself. I spent most of my time reading and thinking about my case. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. My trial was finally approaching, and I was starting to feel hopeful. I knew I was innocent, and I was confident that the evidence would prove it. On the day of my trial, I stood before the judge and jury, hoping for a fair outcome. To my relief, the evidence was in my favor, and I was acquitted of all charges. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I was free at last, and I couldn't wait to start my life again. Looking back on my time in pretrial detention, I realized how close I had come to danger. I was lucky to have survived that attack, and I knew that things could have been much worse. But now, I was determined to make the most of my second chance and never take my freedom for granted. I never thought I'd end up in pretrial detention. But there I was, sitting in a cold, damp cell with nothing but my thoughts to keep me company. The other inmates were rough and intimidating, but I tried to keep to myself and stay out of trouble. One night, however, things took a turn for the worse. I was lying on my bunk, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a commotion coming from down the hall. At first, I thought it was just a fight between inmates, but then I heard something that sent chills down my spine. It was a scream. A blood-curdling scream that echoed through the entire block. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, and tried to figure out what was going on. That's when I saw him. A man was standing outside my cell, staring at me with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. He was tall and muscular, with a twisted smile that made my skin crawl. "Hey there," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You look like you could use a friend." I tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped in that cell with that monster, and I knew I was in serious trouble. He took a step closer, and I could smell the stench of alcohol on his breath. I braced myself for the worst, but then something strange happened. The man suddenly stumbled and fell to the ground, unconscious. I looked around and saw that one of the other inmates had come to my rescue. He had hit the man over the head with a metal tray, knocking him out cold. I was relieved and grateful, but also terrified. I knew that I was not safe in that place, and I needed to get out as soon as possible. Thankfully, I was eventually released on bail and was able to put that experience behind me. But I will never forget the fear that I felt in pretrial detention, or the close call that could have ended my life. I was only 19 years old when I found myself locked up in pretrial detention. It was a terrifying experience, to say the least. I had never been in trouble with the law before, but one stupid mistake changed everything. My first few days in jail were a blur. I was scared and alone, surrounded by hardened criminals. The only thing that kept me going was the hope that I would be released soon. But things took a turn for the worse when I was placed in a cell with a man named Carl. He was a tall, muscular man with a shaved head and tattoos all over his arms. He didn't seem like the type of person you would want to mess with. At first, Carl didn't pay much attention to me. He just sat in the corner of the cell, staring at the wall. But as the days went by, he started to get more and more aggressive. He would yell at me for no reason, and threaten to hurt me if I didn't do what he said. One night, I woke up to find Carl standing over me with a shiv in his hand. He had a crazed look in his eyes, and I knew that he was going to kill me if I didn't do something. I tried to reason with him, but he was beyond reason. He lunged at me, and I barely managed to dodge out of the way. I scrambled to my feet and ran to the door, pounding on it and yelling for help. Thankfully, the guards heard me and rushed in to subdue Carl. They searched him and found several more weapons hidden in his cell. After that close call, I was moved to a different cell, away from Carl. It was a relief to know that I was safe, but the experience had left me traumatized. I couldn't sleep at night, and I was constantly on edge. Thankfully, my trial came up soon after that, and I was released on bail. It was a huge relief to be back in the real world, where I could breathe fresh air and walk freely. But the memory of Carl and the fear he had instilled in me stayed with me for a long time. I learned the hard way that jail is not a place for the faint of heart, and I vowed to never put myself in that situation again. I never thought I would end up in pretrial detention. But there I was, in a cell with concrete walls and a metal door. It was just me and my thoughts, and the occasional shouting from other cells. I had been wrongly accused of a crime, and I was waiting for my trial. The first few days were uneventful. I tried to pass the time by reading books and doing push-ups in my cell. But then things started to get strange. I started hearing whispers in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the whispers grew louder and more persistent. One night, I woke up to find a man standing outside my cell. He was staring at me through the small window in the door. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could tell he was wearing a guard's uniform. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me. I started to feel uneasy. Something wasn't right. I pressed the call button to alert the guards, but no one answered. I tried again and again, but there was no response. I was completely alone. The man outside my cell started to move. He reached for his keys and unlocked my door. I could hear the sound of the keys jingling in his hands. I knew I had to act fast. I lunged for the door, slamming it shut before the man could enter. I pressed my back against the door, heart pounding in my chest. I heard the man curse and rattle the doorknob, but the lock held. After what seemed like an eternity, I heard footsteps in the hallway. The guards had finally come to my rescue. They subdued the man and took him away. I never found out who that man was or why he had tried to enter my cell. But I knew that I had narrowly escaped danger. From that moment on, I never let my guard down. I knew that anything could happen in pretrial detention, and I had to be ready for anything. I never thought I would find myself in pretrial detention. But there I was, locked up with some of the most dangerous people in the city. I was terrified, but I knew I had to keep my wits about me if I wanted to survive. The first few days were uneventful, but on the fourth day, things took a turn for the worse. I was sitting in the common area, reading a book, when a group of guys approached me. They looked like they were up to no good, and my heart started racing. One of them stepped forward and started asking me questions, trying to get a rise out of me. I could tell he was looking for a fight, but I tried to stay calm and not give him any reason to attack me. Suddenly, one of the other guys pulled out a shank and started waving it around. I felt a wave of fear wash over me as they closed in on me, but I knew I couldn't let them get the best of me. I stood up and backed away slowly, trying to keep my eyes on all of them at once. It felt like time had slowed down as they continued to taunt me, but I knew I had to act fast. I took a deep breath and lunged forward, pushing the guy with the shank out of the way and sprinting towards the nearest guard. I could hear them shouting and cursing behind me, but I didn't stop until I reached the guard. I told him what had happened, and he quickly called for backup. The group of guys were subdued, and the shank was confiscated. I was shaken up but relieved to have made it out alive. I knew I had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation and that things could have turned out much worse. From that day on, I made sure to stay vigilant and avoid any potential confrontations. Pretrial detention was a scary place, but I was determined to make it out in one piece. I never thought I'd find myself in pretrial detention. I always assumed I was too smart, too careful to end up here. But as the steel doors slammed shut behind me, I realized how wrong I was. My first night in the cell was terrifying. The sounds of shouting, crying, and fighting echoed through the halls. I felt like I was in a horror movie, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. As the hours passed, I tried to keep myself together. I sat in my bunk, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of how I got here. The next day, I was moved to a different cell block. It was quieter there, but I soon realized that wasn't a good thing. The inmates were watching me, sizing me up like a piece of meat. I tried to keep my head down, not make eye contact, and just survive until my trial. But then one night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard a loud banging on my cell door. I sat up, heart pounding, and saw a man standing there. He was tall, muscular, and covered in tattoos. He had a crazed look in his eyes, and I knew immediately that he was dangerous. "Hey, pretty boy," he sneered, "you're gonna be my new bitch." I was frozen with fear. I had heard stories about what happened to inmates who were marked as bitches, and I knew I had to do something to protect myself. I tried to reason with the man, but he wasn't interested in listening. He just kept banging on the door, taunting me, and making threats. But then, suddenly, I heard footsteps coming down the hallway. The man looked over his shoulder, and I saw fear flicker in his eyes. He quickly ran away, disappearing into the darkness. It turned out that the footsteps belonged to a guard who was doing his rounds. He saw the man and chased him off before he could do any harm to me. After that night, I was moved to a safer cell block, and I never saw the man again. Looking back on my time in pretrial detention, I can't believe I made it out alive. I was lucky to have survived that close call, and I'll never forget how terrified I was in those dark, cold, and dangerous cells. I hope that others can learn from my mistakes and avoid ending up there themselves. I never thought I'd end up in pretrial detention. I was always a law-abiding citizen, but one night, a series of bad decisions led me straight into a cell. The place was dark, dingy, and smelled like urine. The other inmates were rough-looking, and I knew I had to keep my wits about me if I wanted to make it out alive. The first few days were the worst. I barely slept, afraid that I'd be jumped in the middle of the night. The food was terrible, and the guards were always looking the other way when one of the inmates got too rowdy. But the worst part of it all was the isolation. I was cut off from the outside world, and I didn't know when I'd see my family or friends again. One night, I was sitting on my bunk, trying to read a book by the light of a dim lamp when I heard a commotion outside. Shouting, screams, and the sound of breaking glass filled the air. I huddled against the wall, hoping that whoever was causing the ruckus wouldn't find their way to my cell. But they did. The door to my cell was yanked open, and a group of men barged in. They were wearing masks and carrying makeshift weapons. I knew then that they were the same guys who'd been causing trouble earlier. One of them grabbed me by the arm and pulled me to my feet. "Come with us," he growled. I didn't know what to do. I was outnumbered and outmatched. But something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I swung my arm out, hitting one of the guys in the face. He stumbled back, and I took off running. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from them. I heard their footsteps behind me, and I could feel their hot breath on the back of my neck. But then I saw a glimmer of light up ahead. It was the exit, and I knew I had to make it there if I wanted to survive. I sprinted towards it, ignoring the pain in my legs and the burning in my lungs. I burst through the door and stumbled out into the fresh air. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't care. I was free. It took a while for the police to arrive, but when they did, they took me to the hospital to get checked out. I had a few bruises and scrapes, but nothing too serious. Looking back, I'm grateful to be alive. Pretrial detention was a nightmare, but it taught me a valuable lesson. I'll never make the same mistakes again, and I'll never take my freedom for granted. I never thought I'd find myself in pretrial detention, but here I am. It's a bleak and miserable place, full of people who have made mistakes and are paying for them. I've always considered myself to be a law-abiding citizen, but the circumstances that landed me here are complicated. It was my first night in the cell, and I was struggling to sleep. The noise was deafening, with people shouting and crying all night long. I was laying on my bunk when I heard footsteps outside my cell. I sat up, curious to see who was coming. The guard who walked past my cell was new, and he looked uneasy. He glanced over at me, and I saw the fear in his eyes. It made my heart race, but I tried to stay calm. I couldn't help but wonder what had him so spooked. It wasn't until the next night that I realized what he was afraid of. I was fast asleep when I heard a commotion outside. I sat up, bleary-eyed, and saw a man being dragged past my cell. He was screaming and thrashing, but the guards were holding him down. I watched in horror as they took him to the cell next to mine. I could hear him begging for mercy, but the guards didn't care. They slammed the door shut and walked away. It wasn't until a few moments later that I heard the man's screams turn into something else entirely. It was a guttural, animalistic growl that sent chills down my spine. I knew something was terribly wrong, and I was paralyzed with fear. I don't know how long the growling lasted, but it felt like an eternity. Eventually, it faded away, leaving only silence in its wake. I sat there, frozen in terror, until the morning light started to filter in through the window. When the guards came around for breakfast, I asked one of them what had happened to the man in the cell next to mine. The guard just looked at me, a haunted expression on his face. He didn't say anything, but I knew the answer. I was released a few days later, and I never looked back. I still have nightmares about that growling, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if the guards hadn't been there to stop it. But for now, I'm just grateful to be out of that hellhole. I never thought I'd end up in pretrial detention. I was always careful to stay out of trouble, but one mistake was all it took. Now, here I was, behind bars, waiting for my trial. The first few days were the worst. I was scared, alone, and constantly on edge. But as time passed, I started to get used to my surroundings. I made a few acquaintances, but I didn't trust anyone. You never know who's looking to take advantage of you in a place like this. One day, I was sitting in the common area, reading a book, when I noticed a man staring at me. He was tall and muscular, with a shaved head and tattoos covering his arms. He didn't look like the other inmates. There was something different about him, something dangerous. I tried to ignore him, but he kept staring. It made me uneasy, and I decided to move to another part of the room. But as I got up, he stood up too and started walking towards me. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice deep and menacing. I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was in danger. "I'm just going to sit over there," I said, pointing to an empty table. He didn't say anything, but he followed me to the table and sat down across from me. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to sound confident. "Just thought I'd introduce myself," he said, grinning. "My name's Jack." I didn't trust him, but I didn't want to start a fight either. I nodded and introduced myself. We started talking, and I learned that Jack was in for assault. He seemed friendly enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. As the days went by, Jack started to get more and more aggressive. He would come up to me when I was alone and ask me personal questions, like where I was from and what I did for a living. It made me uncomfortable, but I didn't know what to do. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of my cell door opening. I sat up and saw Jack standing in front of me, a sinister grin on his face. "I've been waiting for this," he said, lunging towards me. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to fight back. We struggled for what felt like an eternity, but I managed to get the upper hand. I pushed him away and ran out of the cell, screaming for help. The guards came running, and they separated us. I was shaken, but I was alive. After that, I never spoke to Jack again. I stayed away from him and kept to myself. And when my trial finally came, I was grateful to leave that place behind. I learned a valuable lesson in pretrial detention: never let your guard down. You never know who's lurking around the corner, waiting to do you harm. I was in pretrial detention for a crime I didn't commit. It was a complete nightmare. The place was overcrowded, the food was terrible, and the guards treated us like animals. But that wasn't the worst part. One night, I was trying to get some sleep when I heard something scratching at the wall behind my bunk. At first, I thought it was just a rat or something, but then I heard a low growl. I froze, wondering what the hell was on the other side of that wall. The scratching and growling continued for what felt like hours. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Finally, I mustered up the courage to ask the guard on duty if he heard anything. He looked at me like I was crazy and said he didn't hear anything. But I knew I wasn't imagining things. The scratching and growling continued for a few more nights, and I started to lose my mind. Then, one night, I woke up to find a man standing at the foot of my bed. He was tall and muscular, with a face that looked like it had been chiseled from stone. He just stood there, staring at me with cold, dead eyes. I screamed for the guard, but the man didn't move. He just kept staring at me. Finally, the guard came and shone his flashlight on the man. He was wearing a prison jumpsuit, but his face was twisted into a grotesque smile. The guard quickly called for backup, and they took the man away. I never found out what happened to him, but I was grateful to be alive. I still have nightmares about that night, and I'll never forget the feeling of those cold, dead eyes watching me from the foot of my bed. To this day, I don't know if the man was a prisoner, a guard, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing: I'll never forget the terror I felt in that pretrial detention center. and I'll never take my freedom for granted again. I never thought I would end up in pretrial detention. I mean, I know I made some mistakes, but nothing too serious. But there I was, locked up with a bunch of people who had done some really messed up things. It was my first night in the cell, and I couldn't sleep. The place was so noisy, and the screams of the other inmates echoed through the halls. I lay there, trying to block out the noise, when I heard someone whisper my name. "Hey, you. Yeah, you. Come here." I turned to see a man staring at me from the corner of the cell. He had a strange look in his eyes, and I knew right away that he wasn't someone I wanted to mess with. "I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to sound confident. "Relax, man. I just wanted to talk to you. You seem like a cool guy." I didn't believe him for a second, but I didn't want to provoke him either. So, I walked over to where he was sitting and sat down next to him. "I'm Tony," he said, extending his hand. I shook it, but I was on high alert. I could feel the tension in the air, and I knew that things could turn bad in an instant. We talked for a few minutes, and I started to relax a bit. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You know, I could take care of you in here. Make sure no one messes with you." I didn't like the sound of that at all. I knew what he was really saying, and I didn't want any part of it. "I'm good, man. Thanks, but no thanks." He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't going to let me say no. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. I made up some excuse about needing to use the bathroom and got up to leave. But as I turned to walk away, he grabbed my arm and pulled me back. "Where do you think you're going?" I struggled to break free, but he was too strong. I thought I was done for. But then, out of nowhere, one of the guards appeared and pulled Tony off of me. I was so relieved that I almost started crying. After that, I made sure to keep my distance from anyone who seemed sketchy. And when my court date finally came, I promised myself that I would never do anything to end up back in that hellhole again. I never thought I would end up in pretrial detention. I was a law-abiding citizen, with no prior criminal record. But, one mistake changed everything. It was a cold winter evening, and I was driving home from work. I had a couple of drinks with my colleagues, but I didn't feel drunk. However, I swerved a bit on the road, and the next thing I knew, I was being pulled over by a cop. I was charged with driving under the influence, and before I knew it, I was behind bars. I was scared and confused. The cell was cold and damp, and the only company I had were the roaches scurrying across the floor. But, that was just the beginning of my nightmare. On the second night, I was awakened by a noise. It sounded like someone was trying to open the door to my cell. I got up and peered through the small window in the door. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear faint footsteps. I tried to call out, but my voice was hoarse from screaming earlier. I was paralyzed with fear. What if someone was trying to hurt me? The footsteps grew louder, and suddenly, the door to my cell opened. I could see a figure standing there, but it was too dark to make out any features. I felt a cold draft, and the figure stepped closer. My heart was pounding so loud that I thought it would burst out of my chest. I could barely breathe, and I felt like I was going to faint. Suddenly, the figure stopped and turned around. I could hear the sound of keys jingling, and then the door to the cell slammed shut. The footsteps faded away, and everything was quiet again. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, too scared to close my eyes. The next morning, I told the guard what had happened, but he just shrugged it off and told me I was probably dreaming. I spent another week in pretrial detention before my lawyer was able to get me out on bail. The incident with the figure still haunts me to this day, and I still don't know what would have happened if the figure had come any closer. Now, I never take my freedom for granted. I always make sure to drive sober and follow the law. And I never want to end up in pretrial detention again. I never thought I would end up in pretrial detention, but there I was, sitting in a cramped cell with a bunch of strangers. It was like something out of a nightmare. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. I could feel the tension in the air, and I knew that I was in a dangerous place. The first few days were rough. I tried to keep my head down and stay out of trouble, but it seemed like trouble was always finding me. I was minding my own business one day when a guy came up to me and started talking trash. He was big, burly, and had a menacing look in his eyes. I could tell that he was trying to pick a fight with me, but I wasn't about to give him what he wanted. I just ignored him and went back to my cell. That's when things took a turn for the worse. That same guy started following me around, always lurking in the shadows. It was like he was stalking me. I didn't know what he wanted or why he was so obsessed with me, but I knew that I had to be careful. I tried to stay away from him, but he always seemed to be one step ahead of me. One night, I was lying in my bunk when I heard a noise outside my cell. It was the sound of someone trying to pick the lock. I knew that I was in trouble. I jumped out of bed and started screaming for help, but no one came. The lock clicked open, and the door creaked open. That's when I saw him. The guy who had been following me was standing in the doorway, holding a shiv in his hand. He lunged at me, and I ducked out of the way. I could feel the blade whizzing past my ear. I scrambled to my feet and ran out of the cell as fast as I could. I could hear him chasing me, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. I ran down the corridor, not knowing where to go. I was trapped, with no escape in sight. But then, out of nowhere, a guard appeared. He tackled the guy and subdued him. I was safe, but I was also shaken to my core. I had come so close to death, and I knew that I had to get out of there as soon as possible. Thankfully, I was eventually released on bail, and I got out of that place as fast as I could. I never want to go back there again. Pretrial detention is a scary place, full of danger and uncertainty. I count myself lucky to have survived that close call, and I will never forget the fear and horror that I experienced during those dark days. I never thought I would end up in pretrial detention, but here I was, surrounded by strangers in orange jumpsuits, waiting for my fate to be decided. The constant noise and the smell of despair were suffocating. It was a place where you couldn't trust anyone, not even the guards. One night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was a low growl, coming from the cell next to mine. At first, I thought it was just one of the inmates snoring, but the sound grew louder and more menacing. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I knew something was wrong. I pressed the emergency button on the wall, but nobody came. The growling turned into a deep, guttural sound that made my hair stand on end. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and I heard the sound of metal bending. The cell next to mine had been opened, and the growling grew louder as something started to move towards me. I tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, with only a thin metal gate separating me from whatever was coming towards me. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to calm myself down and think of a way out. Suddenly, the lights came on, and the guards rushed into the room, their guns drawn. I could see the fear on their faces as they tried to contain the situation. It turned out that one of the inmates had managed to break free and was trying to attack me. I never found out what happened to that inmate, but I'm grateful to be alive. The incident left me traumatized, and I couldn't wait to get out of that place. I realized that pretrial detention was a scary and unpredictable place, and I never wanted to be in that situation again. I never thought I'd end up in pretrial detention. But there I was, behind bars with a group of strangers, waiting for my fate to be decided by the justice system. It was a scary place, with a constant sense of danger lurking around every corner. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened one night. I was lying on my bunk, trying to get some sleep when I heard a commotion outside my cell. It sounded like someone was arguing with one of the guards, but the voices were too muffled to make out what they were saying. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just another inmate causing trouble. But then I heard a loud bang, and the door to my cell flew open. In walked a man I had never seen before. He was tall and muscular, with a thick beard and a menacing look in his eyes. I could tell right away that he was dangerous. He didn't say a word, just walked straight up to me and grabbed me by the throat. I struggled to breathe as he tightened his grip, his fingers digging into my flesh. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to fight him off, but he was too strong. Just as I thought it was all over, I heard the sound of footsteps running towards us. It was one of the guards, alerted by the commotion. He quickly assessed the situation and called for backup, and within seconds, a group of officers arrived to subdue the attacker. It turned out he was a dangerous inmate who had escaped from another part of the facility, and he had managed to slip past the guards and make his way to my cell. It was a close call, and it left me shaken to the core. I realized then just how vulnerable I was in pretrial detention, and how easily things could have gone wrong. But I also felt grateful for the quick response of the guards, who were able to protect me from harm. Looking back on that night, I shudder to think of what could have happened if the guards had been just a few seconds slower. It was a terrifying experience, but it taught me to never take my safety for granted, especially in a place like pretrial detention. I never thought I'd end up in pretrial detention. But here I was, awaiting trial for a crime I didn't commit. It was a scary place, full of rough-looking men and women who had already been convicted of some pretty heinous crimes. On my first night, I was placed in a cell with 3 other inmates. They all seemed friendly enough, but I could tell they had been in jail for a while. They knew the ins and outs of the place, and I felt like an outsider. As the night wore on, I tried to get some sleep, but the noise was unbearable. Inmates shouting, metal doors slamming shut, and the constant chatter of guards on the walkie-talkies. I felt like I was in a nightmare. But the worst was yet to come. In the middle of the night, I was woken up by the sound of someone trying to open the door to our cell. At first, I thought it was a guard doing a routine check, but then I realized it was someone else. I could hear the person breathing heavily outside the door, trying to force it open. My cellmates were still asleep, completely oblivious to the danger we were in. I didn't know what to do. Should I wake them up? Should I try to defend myself? Suddenly, the door flew open, and a man burst into the cell. He was huge, with bulging muscles and a crazed look in his eyes. He lunged at me, and I stumbled backwards, hitting my head on the wall. I was disoriented, but I knew I had to fight back. I kicked and punched, trying to fend him off, but he was too strong. He pinned me to the ground, his hands around my throat, choking me. I thought it was the end. I was going to die in that cell, surrounded by strangers who didn't care about me. But then, out of nowhere, one of my cellmates jumped on the attacker's back, knocking him off me. The other 2 joined in, and together we managed to subdue the attacker. We called for help, and soon the guards came running. They took him away, and we were left to catch our breath and try to process what had just happened. I don't know what would have happened if my cellmates hadn't intervened. I might not be here today to tell this story. Pretrial detention is a scary place, full of danger and uncertainty. But sometimes, even in the darkest of places, you can find a glimmer of hope. I never thought I'd end up in pretrial detention. But there I was, behind bars, waiting for my trial. It was a scary place, filled with dangerous people. Every day felt like a test of survival. One night, as I lay in my bunk, I heard a commotion coming from one of the cells down the hall. At first, I ignored it. But then I heard someone yelling, "Help! He's going to kill me." My heart started racing as I realized that something was seriously wrong. I got up and peered through the bars of my cell. I saw a man, tall and muscular, dragging another inmate out of his cell. The victim was struggling and screaming, but the attacker was too strong. He pulled the man into a nearby storage room, slamming the door shut behind him. I knew I had to do something. I didn't want to be a hero, but I couldn't just stand by and let someone get hurt. I started banging on my cell door, yelling for the guards. But no one came. With no other options, I took matters into my own hands. I grabbed a metal tray from my cell and used it to jimmy the lock. It took several tries, but eventually, I got it open. I ran down the hall, towards the storage room. I could hear the victim's muffled screams coming from behind the door. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should call for backup. But I knew I didn't have time. I burst into the room, swinging the tray wildly. The attacker turned around, surprised to see me. For a moment, we stood there, sizing each other up. Then he lunged at me, and all hell broke loose. We fought, punching and kicking each other, knocking over shelves and crates. I didn't know if I was going to make it out alive. But somehow, I managed to get the upper hand. I hit the man in the head with the tray, knocking him out cold. I quickly freed the victim, and we ran out of the storage room, down the hall, and towards the guard station. When we finally made it to safety, my hands were shaking and my heart was pounding. I had never been in such a dangerous situation before. But I had survived. Looking back on that night, I realized just how lucky I was. If I hadn't taken action, the victim might not have made it out alive. But thanks to my quick thinking and bravery, we both lived to tell the tale. And I vowed never to take my freedom for granted again. I never thought I'd end up in pretrial detention, but there I was. The place was dark, dirty, and smelled like sweat and fear. The other inmates were mostly quiet, but every now and then, someone would shout or curse or bang on the walls. I tried to keep to myself, but it wasn't easy. The guards were rough and didn't seem to care much about our well-being. They'd often push us around or insult us, and I saw some of the other inmates get beaten for no apparent reason. One night, I was lying in my bunk, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a noise outside. At first, I thought it was just another inmate, but then I heard footsteps getting closer and closer. I sat up and saw a shadow moving towards me. "Hey, you," a voice whispered. "You're the new guy, right?" I nodded, not sure what to say. "I've got a proposition for you," the voice continued. "I know a way out of this place. But I need your help to get there." I was skeptical, but also desperate to get out of there. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. "Just follow me," the voice said. "But we have to be quick and quiet. The guards will be making their rounds soon." I got up and followed the shadowy figure out of the cell block. We moved through the dimly lit corridors, trying to avoid the guards and other inmates. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel my palms getting sweaty. Finally, we reached a door at the end of a long hallway. The figure pulled out a set of keys and started unlocking it. "Come on," he said, motioning for me to follow him. But just as I was about to step through the door, I heard a noise behind me. I turned around and saw a group of guards running towards us, their batons raised. "Stop right there," one of them shouted. "You're not going anywhere." I froze, not knowing what to do. The figure I'd been following disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone to face the guards. They swarmed around me, grabbing me by the arms and pushing me against the wall. I felt the cold metal of handcuffs being snapped onto my wrists. "You're in big trouble, kid," one of the guards said. "Trying to escape is only going to make things worse for you." I knew he was right, but I couldn't help feeling a sense of disappointment and despair. I'd come so close to getting out of that hellhole, only to be caught at the last minute. As they dragged me back to my cell, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something had been off about that shadowy figure who'd offered to help me escape. I wondered if I'd narrowly escaped something much worse than just a failed escape attempt. I never saw him again, and I never found out who he was or what his true intentions were. But I knew that I'd dodged a bullet that night, and that I'd never forget the fear and uncertainty of being trapped in pretrial detention. I never thought I'd end up in pretrial detention. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught up in a situation that wasn't my fault. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to realize that this was a place where anything could happen. The other inmates were a mixed bag. Some were quiet and kept to themselves, while others were loud and aggressive. I did my best to stay out of everyone's way, but that didn't stop me from catching the attention of one particular guy. He was a large man, with tattoos covering every inch of visible skin. He didn't seem to have any particular allegiance to any of the gangs that operated within the jail, but he made it clear that he was not to be messed with. He would glare at me whenever we crossed paths, and I knew that I was on his radar for some reason. It all came to a head one night. I was lying in my bunk, trying to get some sleep, when I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. I looked up to see the large man standing in front of me, his arms crossed and a menacing look on his face. "You got a problem, man," he growled. I shook my head, too scared to even speak. "Good," he said. "Because I'd hate to have to teach you a lesson." With that, he turned and walked away. I let out a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. I knew that I wasn't out of the woods yet. The next few days were tense. I could feel the eyes of the other inmates on me, and I knew that something was brewing. And then, one night, it all came to a head. I was walking down the corridor, trying to get to the shower before anyone else, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around to see the large man and several of his associates walking towards me. I knew that I was in trouble. There was no way that I could take on all of them at once. I braced myself for the worst. But then, out of nowhere, one of the guards appeared. He had a taser in his hand, and he ordered the men to back off. They did, but not before they gave me a warning glare. I don't know what would have happened if that guard hadn't shown up. I don't even want to think about it. All I know is that I survived my time in pretrial detention, and I'm grateful for every day that I'm not behind bars. I never thought I would find myself in pretrial detention. I mean, I always knew I was capable of making bad decisions, but being locked up with actual criminals was something I never imagined. The first few days were rough. I kept to myself, trying not to make any enemies. But soon enough, I realized that was impossible. I was sharing a cell with a few other guys, all of whom had been arrested for various crimes. They weren't the nicest bunch, but I figured as long as I stayed out of their way, I'd be okay. But then one day, everything changed. I was sitting on my bunk, trying to pass the time, when I noticed one of the guys staring at me. I tried to ignore him, but he just kept staring. Finally, he spoke. "You got a problem, man," he said. I shook my head. "No, I'm good." But he didn't believe me. He stood up and started walking towards me. "You're lying," he said. "I can tell." I stood up too, trying to look tough. "Look, I don't want any trouble." But it was too late. The guy punched me in the face, sending me reeling backwards. I hit my head on the concrete wall and everything went black. When I woke up, I was in the infirmary. Apparently, someone had found me unconscious and called for help. I was lucky to be alive. But that wasn't the end of it. The guy who had attacked me was still in the cell block, and he wasn't happy that I had survived. He threatened me every chance he got, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he tried to finish what he had started. I spent the next few weeks on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I was terrified. But then, one day, I got lucky. The guy who had attacked me was transferred to a different facility. I never saw him again. I know I was lucky to survive. I know it could have ended much differently. But I also know that I'll never forget my time in pretrial detention. It was the scariest experience of my life, and one that I hope never to repeat. I never thought I'd find myself in pretrial detention. I had always been a law-abiding citizen, never even so much as a speeding ticket. But when I was falsely accused of a crime, I found myself locked up with some of the most dangerous people I had ever met. The first few days were rough, but I managed to keep to myself and avoid any trouble. But on the fourth night, everything changed. I was lying in my bunk, trying to get some sleep, when I heard a commotion coming from the cell next to mine. I sat up and peeked through the small window in the door, trying to see what was going on. That's when I saw him. A huge man, easily 6.5 feet tall, with bulging muscles and a crazed look in his eyes. He was pacing back and forth in his cell, muttering to himself and occasionally letting out a loud, guttural scream. I tried to ignore him and go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my stomach. And then, without warning, he started banging on the door of his cell. "Let me out," he shouted. "Let me out of here." I tried to block out the noise, but it was no use. The banging continued, louder and more frenzied than before. And then, suddenly, it stopped. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking that maybe the man had finally tired himself out. But then I heard a different sound, the sound of his door being unlocked. I sat up in my bunk, heart pounding, as the man burst out of his cell and charged straight towards me. I tried to run, but he caught me by the shirt collar and slammed me against the wall. I could feel his hot breath on my face as he leaned in close, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "You're gonna regret ever crossing me," he growled. But then, just as suddenly as he had attacked me, he released me and stumbled backwards, clutching at his chest. I watched in horror as he collapsed onto the floor, dead. It turned out that the man had a pre-existing medical condition that had been exacerbated by his outburst. But in that moment, as I stood there shaking and staring down at his lifeless body, I couldn't help but feel like I had narrowly escaped a much worse fate. From that night on, I kept to myself even more than before, never letting my guard down and always looking over my shoulder. And when my name was finally cleared and I was released from pretrial detention, I vowed never to take my freedom for granted again. I never thought I would end up in pretrial detention. It was a mistake, a misunderstanding that led to my arrest. I was scared, confused, and alone. But little did I know, the worst was yet to come. It started on my second night in jail. I was lying on my bed, trying to fall asleep when I heard a noise outside my cell. At first, I thought it was just the guards doing their rounds, but the noise grew louder and more persistent. I got up and looked out the small window in my cell door, but I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black outside. Suddenly, the noise stopped, and I heard footsteps approaching my cell. My heart raced as the footsteps came closer and closer. I could hear someone breathing heavily on the other side of the door. I backed away, afraid of what was on the other side. Then, a voice spoke, low and menacing. "You're going to regret being here," it said. I froze, unable to move or speak. I knew I was in trouble. The person on the other side of the door sounded dangerous, and I had no way to defend myself. I thought about calling out for help, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Suddenly, the door opened, and a figure stepped inside my cell. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell they were big and muscular. They grabbed me by the arm and pulled me towards them. I struggled and tried to break free, but it was no use. The person was too strong. They dragged me out of my cell and down the hallway, towards the exit. I thought I was going to die. But just as we reached the door, a guard appeared out of nowhere and tackled the person holding me. They wrestled on the ground, and I was able to break free and run towards the safety of my cell. I never found out who the person was or what they wanted from me. But I knew that I had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation. From that moment on, I was always on guard, watching my back and staying as far away from trouble as possible. Because in pretrial detention, you never know who might be lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. I never thought I would find myself in pretrial detention. It was a nightmare, a place filled with people who were hardened criminals, all waiting for their fate to be determined. But it wasn't just the other inmates that made me uneasy, there was something sinister lurking in the shadows of that place. It started on my third night there. I was lying in my bunk, trying to fall asleep, when I heard something moving in the darkness. At first, I thought it was just one of the other inmates, but the more I listened, the more I realized that it was something else entirely. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to listen for any more sounds. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to be coming from the shadows. I was paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do next. Suddenly, the growling stopped, and I heard something shuffling towards me. I scrambled to the other side of my bunk, trying to put as much distance between myself and whatever was coming for me. That's when I saw it, a figure emerging from the darkness. It was a man, but not like any man I had ever seen before. His skin was gray and sickly, his eyes sunken in and filled with a cold, dead gaze. I knew I was in trouble, so I did the only thing I could think of. I lunged for the emergency button near my bed and hit it with all my might. The alarms blared, and the lights in the cell block came on. The man disappeared into the shadows, but the guards soon arrived, asking me what had happened. I tried to explain, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. They searched the cell block, but found nothing. The rest of my time in pretrial detention was a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and I was constantly on edge. But, eventually, my trial came, and I was released. As I walked out of that place, I couldn't help but feel grateful that I had made it out alive. I still don't know what that thing was, or if it was even real, but I know one thing for sure. I never want to go back to that place again.